Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Axelar Learn session. My name is Jackie, and today I'm joined by Chris from Metrika.
Hey,
They will
Jackie.
be covering the Metrika dashboard that they've built for us, and specifically how it can be used by delegators to determine which validators you should be staking their tokens with. Chris, would you like to kick off and introduce us to the dashboard?
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks for the intro, Jackie. So what we have here are the Axelar dashboards on the Metrika platform. What we're looking at right now is the network overview. And the purpose of the network overview is to give you a sense of high-level network health and activity on the Axelar network. At the top here, we can see some statistics relating to block production, which gives you a sense of how the network is progressing and how quickly it's creating blocks. You can see a time series here, and you can see the average and maximum block interval time. And additionally, we show a breakdown by validators so you can get a sense of how frequently which validators are proposing blocks on the network. If we continue further down the dashboard, you can see some information about cross-chain events, particularly as they relate to things like transferring assets and data from Axelar to external chains. And then we also provide some information about bridge account addresses, which is where the wrap tokens are stored on external chains. And then finally, we go to the signing thresholds, which gives you a sense of the shares and some of the threshold keys on the Axelar network. But since the focus of this session is to give everybody an overview about how delegators can use it to make informed staking decisions, we'll go to the validator overview here and talk through some of the metrics we're sharing and how delegators can use them.
Awesome. So there's a lot of, features and information going on here. We'll be only looking like a subset of that to kind of focus our attention and make this useful for delegators, right?
Yeah, that's right, Jackie.
Right. So then, in your eyes, what would you say is the role of delegators within the Axelar network?
Yeah, that's a good question. So really, I want to highlight that safeguarding the Axelar network or really any delegated proof of stake network is not the sole responsibility of validators. The idea is that token holders or delegators can use their Axel to participate in the staking process. And through this process, they can share in the responsibility, rewards, and risk with validators. Delegators get to choose who they delegate their Axel to and how much they want to stake. And in exchange for delegating their Axel, they get to receive a share of the validator's revenue, proportional to the amount they stake, minus a commission rate that validators charge to manage their infrastructure. And additionally, delegators can incur any penalties that are applied to the validator they stake with, meaning that they need to understand how to evaluate validator performance so that they can minimize this risk.
Right, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So then maybe what would you say is the other part of the puzzle, right? What is the role of validators within the network?
Yeah, so validators are really critical, and they're critical because they're running nodes on the Axelar network and the external chains that Axelar supports, and they're really the backbone of the consensus protocol that achieves finality and powers the Axelar's novel cross-chain mechanisms. Right now, there are 50 active validators at any given time, and it's the top 50 based on the stake assigned to them, and each of these validators run external chain nodes that they use to observe and confirm cross-chain traffic. In general, validators have three primary areas of responsibility. The first is participating in the Tendermint consensus protocol. The second is participating in Axelar's multi-party cryptography protocol. And the third is participating in voting events and cross-chain events.
Yeah, so like you mentioned there, AXA validators have a bit more work to do than a typical validator within the ecosystem. Not only are they part of the consensus proof of work, which is because AXA is a Cosmos-based chain, but they also have to do these external chain management and voting and so forth. So there's a lot going on, and we require that the validators have like a lot of expertise in order to manage all of this. And that just means that it is more aspects for delegators to consider when they select which validator they want to vote with.
Yeah, and I do really want to highlight that being a validator, specifically on Axelar, is a complex task, and this requires a lot of knowledge of Axelar's protocol, blockchain infrastructure. And that being said, delegating Axel is a great way for anyone to get involved, even if you don't have this expertise. And while delegating doesn't come with the same requirements as running a validator, it shouldn't really be a passive task. you should be checking validator fundamentals to ensure you're staking with a reliable validator. You should actively be monitoring performance. And if you notice that a validator you've staked with begins to perform poorly, you should move that to another more reliable validator. And the third thing you can do is spread stake by delegating to multiple validators. This manages your risk by spreading it across multiple validators and also helps minimize stake concentration.
Right, and a reminder for any delegators, potential delegators here, if you were to undelegate your stake from validator and then delegate again, there is a lockup period where your tokens have to cool down before they're returned back to your account. But if you use the redelegate function, you can bypass that and switch your stake from one validator to another without any of that timeout. So yeah, definitely a way to keep an eye on your validators to ensure that you're getting the most rewards, you're avoiding any penalties the validator might incur, and this also helps secure the network. So next, I kind of want to walk into this hypothetical scenario. If I'm a delegator and I want to get started with the Metrika dashboard, how might I go about using this platform?
Yeah, great question, Jackie. So I'll just walk you guys through the different sections and talk through what each metric means and how it can be used by a delegator. At the top here, we have a bunch of information related to validator stake. And validator stake is important because it determines its voting power. And this impacts how frequently it's expected to propose blocks and how much weight its votes carry when it signs blocks. Axelar has an additional type of voting, which happens when there are cross-chain transfers of data or assets, we'll call it external voting. For these types of votes, Axelar has a really cool implementation of quadratic voting power, which helps even out the distribution of voting power across validators. And generally, it's nicer to have an even distribution of stake, as that makes it more difficult for a malicious actor, or, any bad stuff to happen to the network. And you can see that here with normal voting power, the top validator has about 8%, whereas with quadratic, it's only about 4%. Additionally, we can look at total delegations. This shows how many addresses have staked their Axel to a given validator. And this is good to see, as a signal that other people are staking to this validator. And that's generally the sign of a healthy validator. And then commission rate tells us how much a validator charges for the maintenance and infrastructure that supports their node. I want to highlight that, selecting the validator with the lowest commission rate isn't always the right move. Rather, commission rate should be one of several metrics you use to make a decision. I say this because, validators on Axelar have to run nodes on multiple networks, and, creating the monitoring, maintaining the monitoring, and, maintaining the performance of those can be costly. So a high commission rate could indicate, validator, being really thoughtful and implementing some best practices. And lastly, the status shows that the validator is actively participating. Bonded means that they are.
Right. Next, should we talk a bit about the validator performance data?
Yeah, so here we have some metrics that give you a sense of liveness. Right here, we're going to look at two of the three areas of focus that I mentioned. One is Tendermint's consensus protocol, and the other is Axelar's multi-party cryptography protocol. I'd say the first responsibility of a validator is to sign blocks as part of Tendermint's consensus protocol. And we measure liveness here by, are they signing blocks? And what we have to track that is missed blocks. If you see a validator with missed blocks, that means that they have failed to sign, a block over the selected time frame. I want to caution that, just because you see a validator that has missed blocks doesn't mean that they're necessarily performing poorly. And I would highly recommend to use these time range filters to look at, longer periods of time to get a sense of how that validator performs more holistically. Additionally, we have, missed heartbeats, and this is part of Axelar's multi-party cryptography protocol. And the idea here is that every 5 minutes, to signal that they're ready to participate, validators need to send a heartbeat transaction. And until they send this heartbeat transaction, they can't earn rewards. So what we have here is a count of how many times a validator has failed to send that heartbeat. And basically, similar to missed blocks, a lower number is better, but obviously you do want to think about this holistically. Keygen participation shows the frequency at which they participate in keygen events or key rotation, which happens periodically. And signing requests tell when they are expected to sign sign or transfer assets to an external chain. If they fail to sign these within the timeout period of about an hour, they can't earn rewards for participation.
Right. So these two missed blocks and missed heartbeats kind of parallel like some of the validator's core responsibilities, which is to both participate in the producing blocks on the Axelar chain as part of Tendermint consensus. Tendermint being the proof of stake consensus layer within the Cosmos SDK that is default to most Cosmos apps, as well as the Axelar specific requirements of being available and ready for cross-chain communication, as indicated by the heartbeat status. Um, So next, why don't we cover what it might mean to lose liveness, right? Either by missing blocks or heartbeats.
Yeah, and this is kind of part of running a validator. It doesn't mean a validator is performing, is a bad validator if they lose liveness. Often a simple node restart can resolve this issue. Sometimes it requires more investigation. And I want to highlight that, especially with Axelar and the external chain nodes that validators run, events on a chain like Polygon could impact liveness there. And sometimes validators need to upgrade their nodes to get it back up to date so that they can participate effectively. And sometimes when you lose liveness, you'll be jailed. And I want to highlight that jailing periods are really a protection mechanism that allows validators to fix issues before they're repeatedly penalized and accrue too many penalties. And I want to highlight again, it's really important to look at the longer term views here to get a sense of if instance of losing liveness was isolated or not.
Right, yeah, kind of determine if that liveness was an issue with the validator setup in Node or if it was, maybe an external event or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so now let's move on and talk about external chain voting, which is kind of the third mechanism of validators' engagement with the network.
Yeah, and we have a whole section for this down here on the dashboards. Like you said, Jackie, this is the third way that validators can accrue rewards, and they do this by participating in voting events to confirm transfers of data or assets across chains. And in order to earn these rewards, validators need to vote correctly on external chain transfers. The most common way to earn these rewards is to vote with the majority to confirm or deny this. And you can see this by whether or not they voted yes or voted no. The two ways a validator can miss out on earning rewards is by abstaining or not participating, which you can see in this column here, or if they vote against the majority, which is often indicated by no votes, but we'll get to this in a bit about how you can really parse out and understand if they're voting with the majority. While this table gives you a snapshot view of, the breakdown of abstain, yes, and no votes over the selected time frame, you can see how this, trends for each validator. And when you're looking at this heat map, dark purple is the best thing to see. That means they are participating in all voting events. Lighter purple, like you see here, means that they are missing some voting events. So with this validator, there might have been some issue with an external chain or something else that caused a lower rate of participation over these couple days, but it seems like they've since resolved it. And then, white or completely empty means that there's no participation over that time frame. At the bottom of this dashboard, we get into the no votes, and we break this down by networks here, so you can get a sense of what does the ratio of no votes look like by network, and then we also look at it by validator. And what you really want to see here is, is the validator's no vote ratio in line with the no vote ratio for a network? If it is, that means they're probably voting with the majority. If it's not, that might mean there's something to look into a bit more. And then the last thing I want to highlight is this latest 1 hour no vote ratio gives you a sense of if the issue has been resolved or if it's a newer issue. 0% over the last hour means that the issue's probably been resolved, whereas if you see a high percentage like you do for a couple of these validators, there might be something that's worth looking into.
Right. And so what sort of issues might be the reason for validators and their nodes to vote incorrectly on cross-chain transfers?
Yeah, I mean, there's some things like, if an external chain has a bug, and I think this might have happened with Binance a couple weeks ago, where, there's something wrong with the software on that external chain, and the validators need to quickly install an upgrade to resolve that bug. These things can happen at any time of day. And if, a validator doesn't immediately respond to it, they may vote no for a short period of time. And like I said, that's not always the worst thing. As long as they eventually get to the issue and resolve it within, a few hours or so, I think that is reasonable.
Right. So we have a question here from the chat. Orb says, I wanted to ask that most of the time, nodes can be down for some period of time. How do you really plan to fix that? So, if you're talking about the external nodes from chain's active support, so for example, an Ethereum node, um, if the validator's node goes down, then they will receive like warnings from the network. They'll be able to see their status change on Metrika as they vote no, for example. And it's up to them to monitor this, realize that there's an issue with their node, and then fix it to bring the node back up. And then from there, they can continue um, proceeding with the external chain voting as usual. Okay, so Chris, now maybe we can move and do a quick deep dive on the validator drill down. So the Metrika dashboard I know has the ability to like look into specific details for any given validator, right?
Yeah, that's right. And you can do that by clicking on a validator's name, which is highlighted by the blue text here. Um, the validator drill down is intended to let you look at a specific validator and understand its performance, at a much more granular level. So at the top here, we basically have some information that, tells you who's running this validator, some of the stats we looked at on those overview tables, and whether or not it's jailed. And we also have the registered voting networks here. As we've been mentioning, a big part of running an Axelar validator is actually running nodes on these external chains to confirm events. And that's why, it's a bit, more involved than running a validator on a lot of other networks. And additionally, we provide a lot of information about how a validator is participating in the external chain voting. So right here, we provide an overview of how it's voted across networks, whether or not it's been abstaining frequently, whether it's voting yes or voting no. And I think with this validator, I mean, it's interesting to see that most of its abstains are isolated to Polygon, which could suggest there's something going on Polygon, there's something up with that specific integration, etc. And then here, this is kind of what I mentioned. When you look at the validator's no vote ratio, you really want to compare that to the network no vote ratio and make sure that it's somewhat in line with that, because that means that it's probably voting with the majority when the votes are no.
And of course, if it's higher than the network no vote ratio, that means there are certain cases where the rest of the network is voting yes, but this validator is voting no, meaning there might be, again, some issue with the node.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Jackie. And then we have a detailed breakdown of all of the latest votes here. So for the last, I think, 250 votes, you can actually plug in these transaction hashes to an explorer like Axelar Scan and look up all the details about what the validator was actually voting on with that transfer, which I think is pretty cool. And you can also see the way that they voted. So generally it's yes, but sometimes there are these abstains. And then for the abstain and no votes, we think it's important to provide some more context. So that's why we have this additional table, and it provides, a drill down into those votes. And the idea here is we add this one column which provides the count of same votes. What this means is it indicates how many validators voted the same way as this validator. So with these abstains, you can see there are 11 other validators that voted the same way, which to me suggests that it's not, an issue that's specific to this validator, but probably some kind of issue with the integration with Polygon that's affecting multiple validators. And I think as a validator, you can look at this to understand what you want to focus on and triage issues. And then quickly, I just want to go through some of the other charts. Basically, we've gone through all of this information. This provides time series views of, how frequently this is happening. So you can see these heartbeats are fairly infrequent. If we look at delegations and stake here, you can see that, for this validator, delegations and stake have increased frequently or relatively recently. You can see delegations actually increased from about 100 to 858. And that means that since stake didn't increase by that much, it's a lot of smaller delegations, which is kind of cool to know. In general, the behavior you want to see here is that both delegations and stake are increasing in time. That means the validator is probably getting, improving their performance, and people are trusting it enough to delegate their Axel with it. And then here we have missed blocks, and you can see how it's participating in the Tendermint consensus protocol over time. And then finally, we have signing participation, which we discussed. So yeah, Jackie, I think this is, the majority of the, metrics that we have to help delegators think through, how they want to stake their Axel.
Yeah, awesome. This gives a great intro to all the plenty of information that's contained here, useful for both validators and also for delegators and observing their validators and choosing. One thing I wanted to point out was if at any point on the Metrika dashboard you have any questions about like maybe what this table means or what's going on here, you can hover over the little I beside the table header, and it contains a description about what's being displayed and the summary of like what's going on. Do you want to maybe elaborate a bit more on that, Chris?
Yeah, so it's obviously important to provide definitions and context for any metric you're looking at. And like Jackie said, you can see some very quick snippets on the dashboard. If you have even more questions, we have a knowledge center for Axelar, and I'll highlight a few things to you here. One is you can see a detailed overview of, what we're showing on the dashboards. And a lot of this is stuff we discussed, but, it's definitions, some snippets about how you can use this information, just so you can really understand what you're looking at and figure out what it means for you. Additionally, we have these quick start videos, which will provide a walkthrough of the dashboard similar to what we did today. And then we also, to talk about how this is relevant for delegators, and if you want to revisit any of this info, we have a guide that really discusses the same things that Jackie and I have been talking about. And you can see here, it's talking through the role of delegators. It, helps you think through what you want to look for when you're choosing a validator and how you can use the Metrika platform to make these decisions. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot more here. And I just wanted to highlight that so that, if you have questions, you want to look at this again, there's some stuff that might help you find what you're looking for.
Awesome, Chris. Any other closing remarks?
No, I just want to thank you for taking the time to do this, Jackie. And for those who are interested about what we're doing at Metrika or have more questions about what we're building for Axelar, feel free to join our Discord at Metrika.
Great. Thanks for coming here, Chris. It's great to have you.
Likewise. Thank you, Jackie. And take care all.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.